This is Jay Scott. I absolutely live and breathe hunting and fishing. I spend more than half the year in the field enjoying God's creation. I've been a professional hunter and guide since the late 90s, and over the years I've been on amazing hunting and fishing adventures that have resulted in many memories, trophies, and wild game dining. I've authored numerous magazine articles that have been featured in Western big game hunting publications and served for 3 years as a judge for the World Championship Elk Calling Contest. I've operated a successful hunting and fishing blog, YouTube channel, and other social media platforms since 2008. You can get all the photos, videos, and content at jscottoutdoors.com. The goal of this podcast is to educate and inform by covering all sorts of topics ranging from tactics, preparation, field judging, calling, scouting, and gear, as well as regular updates on all our hunting and fishing trips throughout the year. Now let's get to the show. Welcome to the J. Scott Outdoors podcast, episode 1. We're fortunate today to be joined by Darr Colburn, my great friend. And Darr and I own and operate a guide service, hunting guide service here in the state of Arizona called Colburn and Scott Outfitters. We have a website, colburn&scottoutfitters.com. Darr is also a regular contributor to jscottoutdoors.com, and we share a real estate business here in the Maricopa County, Phoenix, metropolitan Phoenix area here in the state of Arizona. And so we're around each other a lot, and he's just a heck of a guy. He's a great hunter, great glasser, and it's been fun over the last, pushing 20 years maybe, to know this guy and get to share experiences and hunt with him and fish with him and watch him raise his 2 boys, Parker and Paul. And we're fortunate to be joined today with him, and we're going to talk about how his last couple months has been going. Parker had a deer hunt, and then we had 2 weeks down in Mexico hunting Coues deer with clients and during the rut, and so we've just got a lot of great things to share with you. Appreciate our listeners tuning in, and let's get right to the show here. Darr, how you doing, buddy?
Good, man. How are you?
Good. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about, we've had kind of a heck of a run here the last couple months with Bob O'Connor's sheep and 15D and, being the largest Nelson I harvested this year in the state of Arizona, and beautiful flaring ram, which we'll probably get into detail on another podcast. But one of the most special hunts I know for you was your son Parker, which, by the way, Parker's middle name is Coues, C-O-U-E-S, named after his dad's favorite deer. And Parker finally drew a Coues deer permit in Unit 23 in Arizona. And tell me about your hunt. You guys had a heck of a time, huh?
Yeah, we had a great time. I put him in for that late hunt knowing he would draw it because he had a lot of points. But, the trophy quality potential is there on those later hunts because the weather's cooler. You can see some pre-rut activity. But the main reason was just, that hunt is a little bit longer. It's almost 3 weeks long, and it gave us a chance to hunt during his Christmas break from school, and we got to make 3 different trips into the unit to hunt, which was it's fun spending a lot of time together.
So that first weekend when you went, was he already in break, or did he have to come back and go to school for a few days and then he was off on break?
Yeah, no, he had to. We hunted the first. Trying to remember, I think we hunted 2 or 3 days the first weekend, and then he had to go back to school.
Gotcha. What kind of conditions did you have that first weekend? Was there any rutting at all, or was it fairly warm, or what was the deal?
Trying to recall. The first weekend, I think we had a pretty good storm come through. We actually spent the first afternoon we got up there. We spent pretty much all evening, with the exception of 1 hour, in the truck because it was raining. It did stop, and we ran out and glassed for the last hour and saw some, I think we saw 2 or 3 does and maybe 1 little buck. But then we hunted the next 2 days, and the weather broke. There was a little bit of snow the second morning, so it was cold. But pre-rut conditions on some of the little bucks, But then we also did see, I would say the little bucks were, sniffing the does, but then we saw groups of, I would say, middle-aged class bucks that were still together.
So the bucks weren't traveling and doing that, rut walk, looking around, they weren't moving yet.
No, they weren't moving, staying together, and like you said, not really moving around very much.
I know you and Parker had been working a lot on his gun. What gun? I know he has several. Which gun did he end up taking, and what load did you guys find was working best for him?
Well, he got a 6.5 Creedmoor, a little Weatherby Vanguard, and 6.5 Creedmoor. So he was shooting that. We had practiced quite a bit with it. He shot some 120 grain ballistic tips out of there, and it was shooting like just under 3,000 feet a second, little vortex scope. But we'd shot a lot, before the hunt, out to 500-600 yards. So he had shot the gun quite a bit.
And if I remember right, he his first year when he turned 10, he had that rifle hunt where you and I went up on that hunt, and he was able to harvest his first Coues deer his first year. And then the next year, didn't he shoot a buck with his bow?
Yep.
A mule deer, right?
Yeah, mule deer.
And then so this would be his third year hunting deer. And so tell me about when you guys finally got up there for your final hoorah, and I think you had some rough weather.
Yeah, well, the first 2 years Parker had hunted, I think he had hunted a combined day for the 2 bucks that he shot. His first buck was after school, opening day, drove him out there, and he shot a buck right away that evening. And then
great buck, yeah. I remember that like it was yesterday.
Yeah, and then the archery hunt last year, it was opening day. We went out in the evening and sat a water hole, and he shot a buck after sitting there for 30 minutes. So
a spike? Was it a spike or 2
spike,
point?
little mule deer.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So,
with his bow. How far was it shot with his bow?
It was 30 yards.
30 yards. So, I mean, he's got 2 deer under his belt in a total of 2 days, and he's thinking he's thinking this is easy, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he's a little jaded. He was a little jaded. But he wanted his goal, he wanted to shoot a buck close to 100 inches on this hunt. We had talked about that. And after hunting the first 2 weekends, the biggest buck we saw was probably a 90-inch buck, I'm going to say.
Did you see much noticeable difference in the first weekend and the second weekend as far as activity, or was it still pretty lethargic and not really ruddy?
Where we were and what we saw, I would say it was still pretty slow. Mm-hmm. The weather was a little better the second weekend. I mean, in terms of, we didn't have any storms rolling through. But then after Christmas, we ended up going home right before Christmas, had Christmas, and Parker ended up getting sick. And so he was on having to do breathing treatments like 4 times a day, and had a fever and a cough. And so we were going to go the last, I think, 5 days of the season, but...
Which would be the last 5 days of December, right?
December, yes.
Yeah, after Christmas.
Yeah, we ended up staying at home an extra day to let him hopefully heal up a little bit more, and convinced my wife that he was, everything had broken and he was on his medicine and he was on the road to recovery. So she let us go the last 4 days, and we took his breathing treatment machine and slept in the tent, had one of those big buddy heaters, propane heaters, and it was great. That thing kept the tent nice and warm all night. And
Now, is that one of those that it shuts itself off and it doesn't produce carbon monoxide?
Correct. Yeah.
So you felt, from a safety standpoint, you felt like that was a real good deal, huh?
Definitely, and not that we couldn't handle the cold without the heater, but with him being sick, heater sure made it nice because it just kept it warm in there where I wasn't worried about him getting even sicker. So we hunted. It was kind of funny. We hunted the first couple days and had seen some bucks. Still nothing great. And after the second day, he looked at me and he said, "Dad, this this deer hunting's hard. it's
Welcome to my life.
It's hard. It's not easy. You've been lucky that, the last couple of years you've shot bucks the first day and haven't had to really hunt. So he had hunted 6 days, and he said, I really want to get a buck. I really want to get one. I said, okay, well, we can, shoot the next one we see. He said, yeah, I don't want to go home without a buck. I said, all right, that's great.
Yeah.
So he ended up shooting and missing a 2-point at probably 350 yards. That was chasing does all over the place, and which made it a little bit difficult trying to get him set up, because we'd get set up and then the buck would chase the does around and have.
Now, how many days left? Was there 2 days left or something in this situation, or what?
Yeah,
what day was
there
that?
Was 2 days left, and the last day there was supposedly a big storm supposed to roll in that we potentially might not be able to hunt because the weather was coming. So basically, we were looking at it as our last day in case that storm hit.
Right.
And so he shot at that buck and didn't get it. We actually had another buck that was bigger that we made a play on. He just dropped out of our sight, and we never could locate him again. Got down in a canyon and never could find him, and then he shot at the one.
Now, by this time, were you guys seeing quite a bit more activity? You just hadn't picked up any real good bucks, but you did see a lot more activity?
Definitely more activity. The deer were moving around more. It seemed like the bucks were on the move more. Typically, what you would expect on a pre-rut, bucks cruising, not feeding as much, just out cruising on a line looking for does, I would say.
How much of that do you think was temperature related, and how much of it do you think was just, timing of things?
I think it was more timing, personally, because that first weekend, that the second morning we woke up and there was an inch or two of snow on the ground. So, and the bucks we did see that day were up feeding, but they still weren't moving, covering country looking for does on like a rut walk.
Gotcha.
So I would say it was more timing than weather.
So this puts you guys, you're basically done that night, and a big storm's coming in the next day.
Yep.
And you're in the tent, and is the wind blowing? Is the full storm coming in, or what was it like?
No, it was actually normal. And we had talked to you, been texting back and forth with you and our good friend Cody Nelson at the Outdoorsman's, and trying to get weather updates as to, if we were going to be able to hunt in the morning or what, if it was going to be rain or snow. And so we made a plan that it sounded like the weather was going to come in about 8 o'clock in the morning. And it would
be a whiteout, if I remember
right.
Yeah,
it was supposed to hit pretty hard. Pretty big winter storm for Arizona. And we were in a tent, so we made a plan that night that, we had to at least try. So we got up at 4, and I think it was getting light around 7. So we got up at 4, had breakfast, coffee, and then got camp all broke down, packed up, and got everything put away in the truck other than the stuff we needed. And we ended up going back to the spot where we'd seen the most deer, just thinking that was going to be our best chance at just finding a buck. And when we got up, it was crystal clear, stars out, wind was calm. Temperature was, I'm going to say, mid-30s to low 30s. So it was setting up for a good morning. So we ran down to where we'd seen the most deer previously and sat there for probably an hour and a half, and I don't even think we saw a deer.
Was it one of those things where when it's cold like that typically they just don't even start moving until the sun kind of gets up, like at 8 o'clock, and then they finally start moving?
It very well could have been. It definitely could have been. But after sitting there for that long and knowing we had such a short window, I told Parker, we gotta go try somewhere else before this thing hits. We gotta try and make something happen. So we ended up going back up to a spot we'd been to with our friend Cody Nelson, and it wasn't, I don't know, we'd probably been there half an hour, and the wind started picking up. The clouds were rolling in like, this storm's coming. And it was just about to the point where the wind was getting so bad that you couldn't hardly glass. I glassed up a buck right as he was about to bed down in kind of a wide open yellow grass hillside. And so we got a bead on him, and he bedded down right in the open. So Parker and I made a push over to where he was, and ended up having to hike probably 300 or 400 yards from the road and get set up. And we popped up, and he had been bedded, but when we popped up on the little ridge where we could shoot from, he was up and headed into a ravine where if he got in there, we wouldn't be able to see him anymore.
How far?
It was, I think, about 350. And so he did, before Parker could get him in the scope, he got into this little draw out of our sight, and then it was probably 2 or 3 minutes later he came running out with a doe back to the same spot, and Parker shot and missed him, and shot just underneath him.
At this point, do you think he was just rushing the shot, just not making a good squeeze like you guys had practiced?
Yeah, I think so. I think he was trying to force it too hard, just instead of really taking his time.
We've all been there.
Yeah. So, and it probably didn't help that it was, crunch time, and I kept telling him, this is going to be your last chance. You got to make it count. So that probably didn't help things.
Yeah.
But so he shot at that one, and the buck kind of ran off, but didn't. The wind was blowing so hard, and he was so interested in the doe, he really didn't know what was going on. And he ended up kind of working his way away from us, but didn't really know what was happening. And then probably 10 minutes later, he chased another buck back towards us that ended up bedding down at, I think it was 470. So
now you have 2 Coues bucks out in front of you.
Yeah, but
the wind's blowing. It's starting to snow.
Yep, spitting snow. The first buck that he shot at ended up following the doe and leaving the open hillside. So now we're faced with, we got the other buck is bedded at 470, but you can't see his vitals. All we can see is his head. And the wind was blowing pretty hard. So we were all set up for that yardage and everything, and Parker was on him. And we sat there for probably between, I bet, 30 minutes. And he finally stood up, and Parker made a good shot and shot him.
Awesome.
Yeah, that was fun.
That's awesome. That's his third deer.
Yep.
In 3 years.
Yep.
And he's living up to his middle name of Darr Colburn.
He is, so far.
That's awesome. And then so then you guys came back, and the photos, you can see them on our website on jscottoutdoors.com. Some awesome photos. The pack out was all in the snow, and then by the time you got to the Ranger, there was, a couple inches on the Ranger?
Yeah, it was probably 4 inches, 3 or 4 inches on the Ranger. And, I mean, we took our packs off, and by the time we took pictures and I got it quartered up to pack out, our packs are just covered in snow, and it was pretty neat. You don't get that very often in Arizona.
Yeah, well, that's awesome on the last day, and getting to share it with them. Really cool hunt. And then you and I, you didn't have much time. I think we left on the 6th of January. We take Coues deer hunters down to Mexico, Colburn and Scott Outfitters, and we've done that for years. And let's see, we went down there, I believe, on the 6th. And, honestly, when we get down there, they're typically, starting to move around and starting to act ruddy. And, my recollection of the first week this year, the 7th through whatever that is, the 14th or whatever that date is, just seemed like there wasn't much moving around, which in, past years, sometimes that first week, it's on, and we've shot some of our best bucks then.
Yeah, I would agree. You remember, though, we had that, I want to say the first 3 days, it was 20 to 25 mile an hour winds.
That's right. Yeah, I did forget that it gets so bad windy sometimes in those conditions where literally your binos, you're glassing into the wind because you figure the deer are always going to be on the, the lee side or the non-windy side, but your binos are shaking so hard that at sometimes I remember it was gusting where it was literally pointless to be glassing.
Yeah, it just takes a lot out of you. You want to still be glassing because you only have so many days, but at the same time, it's just not. I mean, those deer are not going to be up moving around very much.
Yeah, and we shot a few bucks on the first week, and our guys had a great time, but it was certainly a little bit of a letdown compared to the success that we've had over the years.
Yeah,
and then
if you remember the buck Chris shot, it was following a doe, but then Dirk's buck on the last evening, it was bedded with 3 bucks.
Yeah, I mean, last evening we split up because Dirk's got to get his buck, and Darr spots a small buck and says, "Hey, I got a buck over here," and Dirk's like, "I want to try this Coues deer meat. I'll take that buck." So Dirk and Gary and I, and Kevin came over there to you guys. It was you and Chris had this buck, and we were on that opposite ridge, and by the time we get down there to you, I can tell something's going on, and a better buck was right there bedded with, what was there? There was a couple 2 points and then the 3x4, whatever the buck Dirk shot, and we were all there and got to watch Dirk shoot that buck. That was pretty cool on the last night of their hunt.
Yeah, it was a pretty neat ending to the week for sure.
Yeah, and then our second week down there, we had Dean Heitzelman and Bill Bertram and Dan Boyd, and so we took the first group back to the border in Mexico and picked up the second group, and we got back to Glasson, and then we had 7 full days after our travel day, and the rut definitely picked up the last week. Would you agree?
Definitely would agree.
But it's interesting, a couple years before, when we were on that ranch, Justin shot that one real pretty 3x3 that first week. Remember how cold it was?
Yeah, and I definitely think that was different conditions that year because of the temperatures,
Yeah, I mean, it was actually so cold that the deer didn't move till probably 10 o'clock in the morning, but then it was, like a 10 to 2 just nonstop, and then they bedded back down. I'm convinced that they just conserve their energy. When it gets that cold, they're just going to lay down. A lot of people think, the rut and deer, when it's real cold, they're going to move. Well, Coues deer, in my opinion, and Darr, you can weigh in on this, they're so thin-skinned that at the certain temperature, when it's that cold, they just stay down and stay bedded until that sun comes up, and, a lot of times you get that midday movement. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. Seems like they're pretty sensitive when it comes to weather and cold and wind, and heat doesn't bother them as much, I would say, but the severe cold, Arctic cold, and certainly wind both affect them.
Yeah, they're finicky little animals for sure. Any little wind chop, Darr and I can pretty much sometimes predict, just from the conditions, we'll be like, they won't be up for an hour because there's, some wind chop, and then as soon as it lays down, boom, they start standing up and feeding all over the place. So that first day, I was with Dean, and you were with Dan and Bill Bertram. Bill had 2 tags in his pocket, and Dean and I spotted this buck up. Ironically, it's where Chris Karvosky had seen that buck the week before.
Yeah.
I look up on this mesa, and I called Darr on the radio and told him, hey, I got a buck up here on the same mesa where Chris saw that buck last week that he had told us he'd seen a good buck. And, Dean and I were looking at it up there, and, he looked pretty darn good. I got some video footage of him up there, and he was feeding on this oak tree, and couldn't tell exactly what he was, but he looked like a real nice buck. And, but, I wasn't, he didn't just jump out that he was, a 110-inch type buck or 115-inch type buck. I thought he's, nice buck. But so I call Darr and tell him, hey, we got a nice buck. And by that time, the buck had kind of moved way down this hill and literally come like 3/4 of a mile closer to us and was rutting around with some does. We were looking at him pretty darn close, and the closer he got, kind of the smaller he looked. He was kind of a little bit crab-clawed in the front, and he did have an extra point, an extra G3 on one side, and Dean, we looked at him, and he said, oh, he's a little crabby in front, and, what do you think he scored? And I got to be honest, I mean, I was saying, at first I thought he was a, 105 type big, plus type buck, and the closer he got, he just kept shrinking on us. I thought he was, a 95 to 100-inch buck, and, being the first day with 7 days to go, Dean had already shot, several nice bucks and bigger than that, and so anyway, he elected to pass, and Dan's like, I'll take a buck like that. And why don't you tell me your perspective on how that all worked out, coming down and meeting up and the whole thing?
Yeah, well, it definitely, I could hear in your voice that you had a good one. But then, like you said, as it got closer, you started, second guessing. And I think part of that, too, was he was up on that mesa in the sun,
right.
And then probably came down where it wasn't in the sun. Which can make it tough when they're in that yellow grass trying to.
Well, and you and I have a general rule that we never like to overjudge anything, yeah. And I'm not saying we're perfect all the time, because we're certainly not. But the last thing we want to do is over guess a deer, and say it's 110 and it turned out to be 100, or say it's 100 and it turns out to be 90.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
You guys made the plan that you were going to go get over on a point across from where that buck was, yep. And he was bedded down over there under some trees.
Yeah, we got over there, and I got to see him. It was probably 450 yards away for a few minutes. He got up and was feeding, and then I thought he looked like a pretty good buck. I thought he was 100, at least 100, and I know Dan was going to be happy with anything in that class. So we made.
Yeah, I mean, he clearly said score doesn't matter to me at all. I love the way that buck looks.
Yeah.
And
so we made a plan. He ended up getting up. Something I think spooked him, right? Or the wind blew hard.
Yeah, a big gust of wind came up, and I'm watching him. Dean and I are watching him through our binos, and he just takes off running, having nothing to do with you guys. Yeah. But then he crossed over and got across that canyon and bedded down. Yeah, I don't know what all that was about. They get real finicky when a gust of wind comes up, but, if you have a lion chasing you every day of your life, you'd be a little spooky too.
Yeah, definitely.
Which, by the way, we had seen a lion the week before.
Right in that
same spot.
Yeah, right in that same spot. So.
How far was his shot?
Dan and I got over there and got on a rock pile right across from him, and it was, I want to say it was 275 or
yeah, that sounds about right.
Something. Anyways, we were over there and set up for no more than probably 10 minutes, and the buck got up and started actually going back up to where you had originally seen him, headed kind of back up on the mesa, and Dan was able to shoot him.
Yeah, and interestingly, that was probably at noon, and just seems like that mid-January time frame, you got to be glassing at all hours of the day, because those bucks just, they may lay for a bit, but they seem like they get antsy, and then they want to get up and go check for does. And luckily, you guys were ready and on it, and you made a great shot. And of course, Dean and I get over there, and I can tell by the look on Darr's face that I'd probably talked Dean out of shooting a buck that he probably should have shot, but Dean was very gracious and very happy that Dan got a nice buck, and turned out to be a 110-inch buck. That was a perfect case there where I'm always learning something about these deer and field judging animals in general, and that buck had more mass than what I thought, and so that's why his points to me were looking short. I think, when they have skinny points, they look long. When they have, a lot of mass throughout the points and all through the webbing of the main beam, it just makes their points look shorter, and I think that's where that buck fooled me. But
definitely the mass there is it definitely made up for it in mass. And it, like you said, its points looked shorter, but it's just because they're heavy.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, we're on the board now with a great buck on the ground. And, the year before, our best buck was Brady Miller, and he's the one that won the Coues raffle hunt. Jason Hairston of Coues was doing a hunt with us and filming it for Western Hunter TV. And they had, I believe, a photo contest, and Brady's photo won the contest, and he won the hunt. And on the same ranch, and he wanted to use his bow, and he hunted for a couple days. This is the year before, so it would have been January 2014. He used his bow for a couple days and just didn't get many opportunities, and it was pretty dry that year, and we talked him into sitting water and shoot. What was he up there, an hour?
Yeah, an hour.
He's up there an hour and had about a 75-inch buck coming in, and he was going to shoot it, 75 or 80-inch buck, and was going to shoot it, but it kind of winded him in his blind. He went up there and put up a blind, and 30 minutes later, this buck comes in. He says didn't even hesitate, came and dunked his head in the water, and Brady shot him at, 25, 30 yards. And
yeah.
He ended up being our biggest buck of the trip last year at 118. I guess the official scored 110 and an eighth or something like that, and they're telling us it's top 20 Pope and Young all time, I think number 17. It's supposed to be panel scored here in a couple weeks at the Pope and Young convention, but
here in Phoenix, actually.
Yeah, so I mean that this ranch has produced some good bucks. I think our best buck before that was a 114 the year before that, but so then Dan and Bill and you kind of kept hunting, and I was still hunting with Dean, if I remember right. And then did Bill get his that night, or was it the next day? And he had 2 tags in his pocket.
Yeah, he had 2 tags, and I think it was the next day, or next day or 2 days later. I can't.
By this time, the deer were moving around, rutting pretty good. They weren't going crazy, but it was definitely better.
Yep.
But it was warm though. Remember, the second week it was pretty much warm the whole time. We did have some wind,
right?
But it wasn't severely cold, and
yeah.
There's that happy medium between too cold, where they don't move, and then just being nice and crisp and cold, and they move a lot. Or if you've got warm temperatures, it seems like they don't move very much at all.
Right.
So, Darr, what do you do on those windy days? Like, consciously, what do you look for, or what do you try and do specifically when it's windy?
Well, I mean, like you talked about earlier, you got to look into the side that's sheltered from the wind, the side of the hill. If you can find the side of the mountain or bedding areas that are sheltered from the wind, you certainly are going to find some deer. And, man, you almost have to just pick an area where, in my opinion, they're going to bed, and they like to bed on that slope that's out of the wind, and just sit there and pick it apart and hope they stand up.
Isn't it a lot? It's kind of parallel to glassing when it's warm, when you have those weeks that, have got warm temperatures, and that they're on the shady sides of the hill, where you specifically start targeting afternoon glassing into the shade pockets. Yeah. Similar thing with the wind.
Yeah, I would say very similar.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're with Dan and Bill, and you guys spot a nice clean buck, and Bill wants to get on the board with his first Coues deer, living in Wisconsin, and you guys ended up getting over there on a stalk and got a little closer. Than you kind of broke the Colburn and Scott Outfitters rule of getting inside of 300 yards of a deer you wanted to shoot, and tell me what happened.
Well, yeah, the buck had bedded, and we had to go way around to get over to where he was, and I knew where he was at from hunting the ranch before, and we got over there, and the buck had actually gotten up and moved off of kind of this flat ridge and down into the canyon, and so I didn't
chasing does.
Yeah,
he was
following
with
a couple does, and basically where he moved, the gig was up. I mean, we didn't spook him; it's just he moved with the does, and he was down off the flat that we could see. So our chances of getting the buck were slim at that point. So But Dan said he was right below us and could see him, and so we walked down the finger and actually just looked over, happened to catch a doe moving, and on the finger across from us, and it was, I think he ended up being like 100 yards away.
Yeah, and Bill was shooting a 33.78 with was it 180 grain bullet?
Yeah.
And I mean, when this bullet hits this deer, I mean, you talk about a carpet sweep.
Yeah,
oh my goodness!
It didn't even twitch.
Darr, you mentioned something there that I thought I would bring up. We hunt a lot for Coues deer in Mexico. We use radios. It's perfectly legal in the state of Arizona and in Mexico, and we find it very effective to use radios. We have found that the hunters really like it because there's a lot of, back and forth, and Darr and I are constantly debating and, going back and forth with each other, and it makes for, real good camaraderie. But would you also agree that as far as efficiently killing these deer, once you spot them and you keep a spotter on them, keep your eyes on them, it takes your success level and goes way up. Would you agree?
Definitely. I definitely.
And I mean, we're hunting big open country where, sometimes the closest you can get to them is, 350 yards across big canyons and what have you.
Yeah, and it's just nice for what we do to go different places and, spread out. But then once somebody finds a buck they want to shoot, we can all help each other and work together, which is, what we do best is work together instead of just everyone on their own.
Yeah, I mean, that's one tip we can give to the guys out there. If it's legal in your state, and you like using radios, it seems like everybody's using some sort of communication these days, and it just makes efficiently and effectively getting your deer. It just makes it better. I mean, if a buddy's watching the buck and maybe you wound the buck or maybe don't make as good a shot as you want, someone's watching them at all times. There's never a time that someone isn't watching the deer.
Yeah.
So that, if you have to go off in the brush after them, right where to start. We've had instances where bucks have been shot and it gets dark and buddies stay on opposite ridge with their binos on the spot, not moving it. And the guy waits till the hunter walks into his view with the headlamp on and says, okay, you need to keep going. So it's a pretty effective tool.
Not to mention just the safety aspect of it, just knowing where everybody's at all times and that everybody's okay and that sort of thing.
Yeah, you can always check in with your buddies and see how they're doing. So Dean is up next. The cowboy had seen a pretty good buck, and he was trying to tell me in Spanish where it was, and I was pretty convinced that night I knew where it was, and he had seen it right at dark, rutting with some does, and in this Ocotillo-type country. And, well, anyway, we go out where I thought it was. Actually, I second-guessed myself on the way over there, and I took a different road and started glassing for about 30 minutes, and it was just eating at me. And I finally, Dean and I looked at each other, and I said, why don't we just go back and draw a map so we're sure compared to that water hole and that gate where that buck is? And so we did. Turns out the buck was right where I thought it was before I second-guessed myself. So we drove up there and got up on this big high point, crawled out on these rocks out in this above this Ocotillo flat, and probably 30 minutes go by. Boom, I look down there and I pick up some does, and I pick this buck up, and it's a nice buck. I figured I'm somewhere between 100 and 105, and, at that point there was, a couple days left in the season, and so Dean said, I really like the look of that buck, and so I called you, Darr, you and Dan and Bill, and you guys came over to me, and then you and Dean, we stayed on the deer up on the Ocotillo Point, and you and Dean made a stalk down there, beautiful stalk down there. Got what, 290 or something, 300?
Yeah, it was under 300, I think, just under 300.
And that buck had been chasing does all morning while I was waiting for you to get over there, and he was tucked way up in this shade pocket, wasn't he? I mean, just buried in this shade hole.
Yep, and it seemed like that's another good example, though. You went and looked right where the cowboy had seen him and picked him up. I mean, it seemed like 15, 20 minutes after you got there. And then uh, that buck was, if I remember right, that buck was running around with those does pretty much all morning.
Yeah, he'd been rutting all morning hard, chasing them, and the does really didn't want to have anything to do with them, so they just kept zigging and zagging, and the buck would not leave them alone, literally, and that's where when you're glassing these Coues deer, if you're just glassing and scanning for movement, you can pick up a lot of these deer, and don't be afraid to glass right at straight up noon, because when they really get going, it seems like they're moving all day. And anyway, you guys get down there, and Dean made a great shot on that buck, and so we got his buck down, and I believe we have 2 days left in the season.
Yeah, that sounds right. And that buck, I want to say that buck, we didn't even get over to where you guys were till like noonish, I want to say.
Yeah.
And then,
I mean, you were on the clear other side of the ranch.
Yeah.
So you had quite a ways to come over.
So that buck had been up pretty much, half the day.
Yeah. He literally, the does would try and go over and bed down, and he'd get up, and, they just were constantly moving. And like zigging and zagging, like going 100 yards and then coming back on the same path 100 yards, and then, going over here 50 yards, like no rhyme or reason, just, he was just harassing those does. Turned out, nice buck, 104, 105 inch type buck.
Yeah, and it didn't have one or two eye guards.
Well, it was missing its eye guard on one side, or, it probably would have been 7-inch type buck.
Yeah, it's a neat character kind of buck.
It's kind of a wide, it's kind of like that buck you shot on that neighboring ranch, 10 years ago that went close to 120. It's kind of a wide, kind of odd, some of the points are long, some of the points are short, but he's kind of a Texas-looking, wide looking buck.
And huge body.
Oh, that buck had a big old body. I think we took some pictures of that body. The pictures are on the website, jscottoutdoors.com. But, yeah, I mean, big-bodied deer for sure. His tarsal glands were all he had been rubbing. It was pretty cool. And then let's go ahead and fast forward. Actually, somewhere in there, Dan, tell me the story about our second lion of the trip, which Dan, tell me briefly about Dan almost getting a shot at that lion, or getting a shot at that lion. Or
Well, yeah, I had gone up on a big peak, and Dan and Bill had taken the Ranger, and Dan had dropped Bill off, and he had gone to the end of the road out on the point, and I glassed up a lion probably 45 minutes before dark, and watched him go a couple ridges and then bed down. And Dan was kind of over in that area, so I had him walk down a point and look into this kind of canyon where I thought he'd be able to see the lion, and he could see the tree 2 ridges over where the lion was. He could see the tree that was like 20 yards above the lion where the lion was bedded, and then he could see 10 yards below the tree, but basically we were within 4 or 5 yards of him being able to see where the lion was bedded. And so I was hoping, we sat there, and I was hoping the lion would get up and go uphill, which he didn't, and it got to where it was starting to get dark, and we talked about just trying to fire a shot over there by the...
Which never works,
by the oak tree, that he could see, in hopes that the lion would, run up to where he could see him, and that was kind of our only chance. So he tried it, and dang it, if that lion didn't run right up underneath the tree that he could see, and he shot at him again and missed him. It was, I want to say it was like 500 yards or 550 yards, but it made for an entertaining evening for sure.
Yeah, we were listening to the whole play-by-play show, Dean and I, and we were listening to all that, and it was fairly exciting listening to you guys chasing that lion. And so Bill got his second tag. Okay, so we have 2 days left, and you spot a buck. I was half as close to that buck, so you sent me on wild run over there to try and get my eyes on that buck, and I did, and I got up, and I remember you telling me, look on that Ocotillo Point, and anyway, boom, I get the buck, but just as I get him, he's kind of going over this hill, and anyway, I stayed right there on covering that whole backside of the hill, and you guys relocated all the way around, took the Rangers around, and came up where that buck should be right there in front of you. And didn't you pick that buck up?
Yeah, we got set up over there, and probably 15 minutes after we had set up, the buck stood up. It must have been bedded right where you last saw him.
But just out of my sight.
But yeah, on the backside, the side opposite side of the hill that you could see. And he ended up walking across kind of the hillside, probably 250 yards, 200 yards, and getting down to where we couldn't. There was another ridge blocking our view of where he went. So we left Dan stayed up there, and I went and grabbed Bill, and we moved in closer and to where we could see where the buck had gone, where we last saw him go into.
And then I relocated all the way around and got up above where I was above you guys, but had a good vantage on the buck where he was bedded.
Yep.
And that stinker stayed bedded from, 1 o'clock till...
No, it was like 11 o'clock, 11:30 when we got over there.
Okay, so 11:30 till, literally a last light. No, he got up one time with like 30 minutes to go, but didn't he just get up and he was behind that bush for a second, and then he bedded right back down by that rock?
I want to say he got up, he went to the bathroom, took a couple bites, and laid right back down pretty much in the same spot.
Yeah, no shot, and then so you guys are just laying down there baking in the sun all day.
And we're at 400 yards from him and could see him when he stood up, but just couldn't see any of his vitals.
Yeah. And so, dang if, last light, the buck gets up but never offers a shot, and so you guys elected, don't push it, And so we make the plan to everybody go back in there the next morning. I went around the backside again to the original spot, and we glassed till 11 o'clock in the morning?
Yeah, I'm going to say 11:30 or noon probably. Yep.
With no sign of the buck, and we had nicknamed the buck Bingo. And so anyway, this is our last evening, last afternoon, wanting to make sure Bill gets that buck. So I came around on my Ranger and came and decided I was going to go up and kind of penetrate into the country where he was, and Darr kind of did the same thing. And I pick up a buck like 1,000 yards out, and he's walking right at me, and he looks like a big rack, big buck. And then I realized he's got branches in his antlers, and that's what made him, he looked like a big non-typical, but by the time I really was looking at him, I realized that was a big branch that he had broke off in his antlers. At that point, I didn't know which buck it was because he still had brush in his antlers, but I could tell it was a really nice buck. And he was 1,000 yards out, but he's walking dead at me, and he's coming to a canyon that I'm literally like 350 yards from, and if he comes down in the canyon, we're going to get a shot at him that afternoon. And he comes down, he shakes the branches out of his, and then I realize it's the heavy 3-point that Darr was calling Bingo. And he comes finally, he's walking, just kind of rut walking. He finally slows way down on the shady side of this hill, and he goes to just about to bed down, and I look up, and about 100 yards, a coyote comes perpendicular to his line, turns and comes right down his scent trail, comes right down, and I'm just watched him. And I'm telling Darr, I'm like, this coyote's coming right at our buck. He's sniffing our buck out, and danged if he doesn't jump that buck. They take off running at a full sprint, that coyote chasing that buck, for close to a mile. If that buck would have bedded right there in the shade, Bill was already coming our way. Darr was already coming to me. We were going to get a shot the last afternoon. We were going to probably get this buck. And that coyote jumped him up and ran him into some completely different country. So we didn't have a lot of time. So Darr and I kind of bounced around on these knobs and got where we could look over in that country where he was. Well, Dan had kind of doubled back around. Dan's like, I forget exactly what he said, but he said, I think I got a good buck, guys. I got a good buck. And we're like, is it Bingo? And he's like, I don't know, but it's big. And what was that, like 30 minutes left of light, or hour?
Yeah, probably an hour, I would say.
I mean, the sun was definitely starting to set, and anyway, Darr gets over on the buck, so now Darr and Dan can see the buck, and you're how far are you from the buck, Darr?
Oh, I'm probably 1,500 yards.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, we knew it was a good buck, but we didn't know if it was that buck that we'd nicknamed Bingo or not.
Yeah.
And anyway, I run down to the road where I met Bill, and then we made a stalk up there, and the buck fortunately bedded down kind of between this tree, and Bill laid down and shot him, I think 292 yards or 290 or 95. One shot just cracked him, and he turned out to be a beautiful 4x4, which is rare for Coues deer. You know, you don't see many 4x4s. Yeah. He went like 108 inches. Just a beautiful buck right at last light.
Yeah, so it was a mad scramble the last hour of light, and Bill made a good shot, and we got it done.
Yeah, in closing, Darr, as many years as we've been going down to Mexico, 15, however many years it is, it seemed like that ranch, we saw quite a few coyotes chasing deer. It seemed like the predators have probably taken its toll a little bit on that ranch. And, from the first year we went there, we kind of thought our deer numbers were at least in half.
Yeah, we definitely saw, I would say, less deer, less on the quality side, antler growth.
And, I mean, even our doe numbers were down.
Yeah, even doe numbers. But like you talked about being down there turkey season, we get down there in January and the feed looks good, but when you're there, or we're there in the spring, early summer, it looks like, moonscape the last years because of the drought
Yeah, so I mean, I think they go into, I think Mexico the last several years has been down antler quality all over. I mean, they're still shooting some good bucks here and there, but when the conditions in the spring are so bad that they have to get their bodies nutritionally sound before they can really start growing antler. And when it's dry, it's just tough. They've got quite a bit of feeding to do after they drop their antlers to get their bodies in this position. And, the problem is, April, May, June, that's our driest years, or driest months this time, in Arizona and Sonora, Mexico. I mean, that's before our monsoon season. Virtually, we get no moisture. Anyway, I think our ranch has dropped a little bit in quality. Hence, here in the next couple of weeks, we're headed down. We've got a handful of ranches to look at for next year, and exciting stuff.
Definitely, and the thing about Mexico is the lack of hunting pressure down there. Even though it wasn't as good, it's still very good compared to the state land hunt here in Arizona.
Yeah, I mean, it's apples and oranges. I mean, it's just great to go lock those gates on the ranches and, have 40,000 acres to yourself. And,
right.
What's nice is you can pass a deer and come back and know that nobody else has chased him off. Maybe a lion or a coyote, but nobody shot him. Nobody's, shot him and quartered him out and he's gone. So Mexico will sure spoil. We've had some great years down there, and, our clients and you and I personally have shot some tremendous bucks and had some of the best adventures of all down there,
sure.
Wouldn't you say?
I think it's one of our favorite hunts, and there's a reason we keep going back down there. I mean, it's hard to beat.
Yeah. So, well, Bud, I think that's going to wrap it up for this episode, and congrats to Parker on his deer, and congrats to you as a father for, getting both your boys out there, hunting and fishing and target shooting and doing all the stuff you do. It's obvious that they both like it, and it's a family affair. And I know you guys are eating, wild game meat all the time. And
we actually have Parker's. I got Parker's back straps marinating tonight for steak. So
yeah, you sure have got that down. And we had several back straps down in Mexico after we shot with your little. Why don't you tell me real fast what you put it in? What's your little secret?
Well, we've been doing it for 2 or 3 years down there, they cook on mesquite wood coals down there, so we always like to save our back straps from the deer separate and get them chilled out real nice, and then clean them up, and then slice them into little medallions and marinate them for a day or two in Italian dressing, and then grill them over those mesquite coals. It's hard to beat.
It's just mouth-watering. They're so tender and so good. Phenomenal tasting deer. If you haven't tried Coues deer,
Yeah.
It's just out of this world. Well, buddy, thanks for joining us, and I look forward to some more of these. And you have a safe drive home. I know it's a little rainy today. We're fortunate to get some moisture. So real fast, Darr, what do you have on the upcoming list here? What hunts do you have coming up this spring?
Well, I'm hoping to do a predator hunt with our buddy Craig Steele, and then hopefully do that in March or early April, and then maybe a Lee's Ferry fly fishing trip and
Spring break.
And Parker's got a juniors turkey hunt in April, and then we're headed to Nebraska to do some turkey hunting in May. So.
Awesome. Yeah, that the Nebraska trip will be something. I know you've been wanting to get out there, and you have family that's from there, and probably nice to get back there and see some of that country that they've loved for so many years. And
what's your adventure? What do you got next on?
We're going to go down to Mexico and look at some of these Coues deer ranches here in a couple weeks, you and I. But next hunt is end of March. Jay and Will over in California, my nephews. They're not little anymore. They're both big, giant men. But going to go shoot a couple Rio Grande turkeys in California, and then we come back and have a slew of Arizona hunts here, and then Mexico Gould. So the spring should be good.
Yeah, for sure. You're getting your turkey call on for sure.
Yeah, I'm starting to strut around. So, well, thanks for being with us, and it's always a pleasure guiding with you, and it's been fun hunting with you for as long as we have, and enjoying our real estate business together. You can follow Darr on Instagram at Darr Colburn, Darr Colburn, D-A-R-R Colburn, C-O-L-B-U-R-N on Instagram. Darr's also a regular contributor to jscottoutdoors.com, and then we have our website, colburnscottoutfitters.com, and one of the best guides in the state of Arizona. Even though I'm biased having Darr be one of my greatest friends, it's no doubt he's one of the best guides in the state. So it's always a pleasure having you, buddy, and I look forward to the next conversation.
Likewise, man. Thanks.
All right, buddy. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the first episode of the J. Scott Outdoors podcast. I want to finish real quick by demonstrating 2 turkey calls that I picked up at the National Wild Turkey Convention in Nashville, Tennessee. I got a bunch of calls, but here's 2 of them. This is the first box call is a Ty, T-Y custom calls. It's got a real nice sweet sound to it. Check it out. Nice box call there by Ty Custom Calls. The second one I want to show you is from Talking Stick Game Calls. This is another box call that's got a little different sound, but sounds real nice. Talking Stick Game Calls. I had a great time at the NWTF National Convention, and looking forward to turkey season coming this way, and it's coming fast, and can't wait to hear those birds gobbling. And thank you for tuning in, and I'm going to leave you with a little bit of sound of spring that we'll be hearing here shortly. These are some Gould's turkeys that I filmed down in Mexico, and so look forward to having you guys join us back next week. Thank you.